Hello and welcome to Inside Exercise. I'm Emeritus Professor Glenn McConnell. Today I've got Dr. Nick Tiller from Harvard UCLA. He's an expert on COPD and exercise, and also he does a lot of research on ultramarathons. But the reason I've got him here today is mainly because he's an expert on being skeptical. He has a book called The Skeptics Guide to Sports Science. So looking at the need to be skeptical of claims in exercise and nutrition. We talked about how it's so important now, especially with social media. You've got all sorts of claims flying around, and you might tend to think this person's got a lot of followers or this person's an athlete. So you may be less skeptical of them. The need to be critical with data. So whether you're in the public or you're a researcher, how you've got to really look at the data, your own data, data in papers you're reading, and be critical. The difference between being skeptical versus critical versus cynical. He introduced me to the concept of pre-bunking. This is where you try and inoculate people to dodgy claims, so that then if they hear new claims, they are able to debunk them themselves. We had a wide-ranging chat. I learned a lot. I think you'll get a lot out of it. I need to say that unfortunately the audio is a problem from my end during this podcast. I don't sound good at all. It comes and goes. Nick sounds fine. Please try and stick at it. It's a great podcast. As you can see, I've got a new microphone here and things are sounding better. Thanks.
Hi, Nick. How are you? Thanks for coming on Inside Exercise.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I mean, I think this stuff is different, obviously. So the podcasts I normally do is, the who's who of exercise metabolism, exercise physiology, exercise and health. But here we've got a man I think is perfect because, you're a researcher and but you're also a skeptical man. And that's what we need in research and what we need more and more in life with, social media and things. So it's great having you on.
No, it's great to be here. And I think it's awesome just having more people like yourself who are interested to give some coverage to skepticism and critical thinking, particularly in our discipline, because we need more and more people to be doing it. It's absolutely critical for us, excuse me, pun intended. And I'm sure that, over the course of the talk, we'll get into why it's important for us as practitioners and scientists and for the discipline as well.
Absolutely. I think it's even becoming more and more important. I mean, with, you've got the polarization with, social media and politics. And so as you say, we're talking about sports science here, but naturally you can sort of apply it to every day, when you read what you read in the media, what you see on, TV or, which is the media anyway. But yeah, so I wanted to start off how, the reason I even got onto you is interesting. So one of the early podcast guests is Karlman Wasserman. It's on the podcast talking about glucose metabolism, and he told me an interesting link with you. So why don't you just explain that one to me a little bit?
Well, I've been working for the last 3 years at the Lupus Institute at Harvard UCLA Medical Center, and the institute was essentially founded by Karlman Wasserman and Brian Whipp. And just being, both of those guys are, very sadly not around anymore. But when we're working at the institute, you can feel the legacy that they've left behind. And I'm so lucky to work with some wonderful scientists like Rich Casaburi and Bill Stringer, Janos Polsas, Harry Rossiter, who in one guise or another have been mentored by Wasserman and Whipp. And I'm sat in Karlman's old office, and I have his old phone, and all of his little knickknacks and gubbins are sort of scattered around the office. And so even though he's not around anymore, his influence is still very much there. And so obviously David Wasserman is a friend of our lab, and I met him actually only for the first time about maybe 5-6 months ago, and we hit it off and had a very long chat, and that's how I got linked to you.
Yeah, well, it's actually interesting because you've got this legend and you're in his office and you've got all these knickknacks. I guess you can't just sort of do a spring clean or whatever. You've got to be a bit careful.
Well, I tell you, I was actually given his old phone, his old office phone, and it says Karlman Wasserman on it. And they said, Nick, what do you want it to say on there? I said, you're not changing that. You're leaving that. So I've got his old extension. When somebody if they can't get through to me on the office phone, if they call his number, it comes through to me, but I refuse to let them give me his old number. Yeah.
Good man, good man. All right. So as I said, you've got your own research interests, and you're a skeptical man, which I'm a skeptical person myself. But maybe I need to up my game. I'm sure I'm going to learn a lot. But I'm a very critical person. Sometimes I've got to be careful. Maybe we'll talk about that later. Skepticism versus being critical versus being like even a cynic or whatever. But why don't you just tell us a little bit just about your own research first, and then we'll talk about all the skeptical stuff.
Sure. My research is quite, I'd say, eclectic. So I come from a kinesiology background, a sport and exercise science background, did my master's in exercise physiology and nutrition. That was a master's by research, which I did in North London. And then I did my PhD in human respiratory physiology. And so I sort of became more and more specialist in respiratory. I now, as I said, work at Harvard UCLA Medical Center, which is an exercise physiology and respiratory medicine lab. So the main core of my research, the stuff that I'm actually funded to do, is looking at respiratory medicine in obstructive lung disease. So most commonly, we look at COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder, and trying to understand the physiology and pathophysiology of the disease. We run clinical trials, and also our lab is famous for essentially putting together pulmonary rehabilitation programs. So Casaburi, for example, did a lot of his PhD and postdoc work looking at pulmonary rehab in COPD, and we still run rehab programs with COPD patients. So the core of my research is, as I said, looking at the physiology and pathophysiology of COPD. We're an exercise physiology lab first and foremost, so anything to do with exercise physiology and to a certain extent exercise performance as well. We'll look at this. So we're just about to publish a study looking at critical power thresholds in healthy and COPD patients. And I have a personal and professional interest in ultra endurance exercise. So I started doing ultra marathons back in about 2008, 2009. And over the years, I've become more and more interested in looking at that from a physiological perspective. So I've published a bunch of studies now and review articles exploring the pathophysiology of ultra endurance exercise, specifically ultra marathon. And we just published a paper looking at sex differences in the physiological response to ultra endurance exercise as well. So that's sort of, I suppose, I look at both ends of the spectrum. We look at working with patients with respiratory disease, and at the other end of the spectrum, I'm interested in ultra endurance exercise. So really spanning the full spectrum.
That's interesting, because I think, remember, I made a comment just a week or two ago. You put out a paper you were finding with ultra marathons, the males were getting more problems with their respiratory function during the race or something, and I made a comment on that. So why don't you just, as a last little tidbit of your research, why don't you just tell us about that paper, or a paper you're really proud of or something, and then we'll...
Yeah, I am particularly proud of that paper because it's one paper so far that's come out of a collaboration that was set up between myself and the Mayo Clinic, a couple of different sites actually. And I hooked up with these guys because they were planning this expedition to UTMB, to Chamonix, to collect some data at the Ultra Trail du Mont Blanc, which is one of the biggest ultra marathons in the world. And at the time, I was doing some research into respiratory function, respiratory responses to ultramarathon, and it turns out that they needed a respiratory physiologist to add to their team. So in 2019, we went out to Chamonix and spent 3 weeks there collecting data at the start-finish line of Mont Blanc. And we've got this huge data set of, I say huge, I mean, in ultramarathon terms, it's pretty huge. We've got about 55 athletes who completed the race, which is actually one of the larger data sets given the magnitude given the scale of the thing. And for the first time, we were actually able to do a comparison between males and females. So we matched males and females for their finish time. So they had exactly the same finish time and running velocity throughout the race. And we have a whole battery of tests that we looked at immediately before and within a couple of hours after the race, which was as soon as we could get back in. And as you said, one of the very interesting things that we found, and again, this is a small data set, so we don't want to overstate the results, and we can even refer to this as preliminary data if we like, but we found that when we looked at the frequency of physiological perturbations post-race and the magnitude of the perturbations as well, so the effect size, we found that males had more frequent physiological perturbations, and the magnitude of the effect was greater in males as well. So we're talking about spirometry changes, lung diffusion capacity, the prevalence, the magnitude and prevalence of pulmonary edema, which we assessed with transthoracic ultrasound. We looked at a whole bunch of biomarkers in the blood, so for musculoskeletal, renal function, cardiac quote-unquote damage, so troponins and BNP. And yeah, so we found that males on the whole exhibited more frequent perturbations with a greater magnitude of effect. So this is very interesting. As I've said, it's a small data set, but it does give us the first kind of empirical evidence that actually it could be that females are more physiologically robust to be able to sustain the rigors of ultramarathon racing. But we need to do more research into this, and it warrants more prospective study, but it's interesting nonetheless.
All right, so that's interesting. So why don't we just move on for that? I like that you said twice, you said, well, this is a relatively, I think you said 3 times, putting down the data a bit. It's actually stores more, and we got to be careful, whatever. So you can see the skeptic. I can see you being skeptical about your own data, which is also good, right? So why don't we get into that? So I guess the biggest claim to fame right now is you've got a book called The Skeptic's Guide to Sports Science, and you've actually got won awards for that and everything. So why don't you tell us a bit about your book? And
yeah, I'd be happy to. So I actually conceived the idea for the book back in 2009. So it was a long time in development. And at the time I was working at the English Institute of Sport, which is the service provider of choice for the Olympic performance programs in the UK. It's obviously based on the Australian system, the very successful Australian system. And at the time, as I said, I was working as a physiologist there. And I had a master's, I hadn't done my PhD at that point. And so I'm working with athletes, and I'm getting more and more involved in physiology support in the health and fitness industry, the health and wellness industry. And it occurred to me that all of the principles of science and scientific skepticism, so we think of humility and evidence-based practice and integrity in research, integrity in data, and prioritizing the process of science above and beyond any conclusions that might result, trying to eliminate bias, all of these things that we associate with being a good scientist and being a good critical thinker were in stark contrast to what we see in the health and fitness industry, where marketing is king and science really takes a back seat to the marketing. And so that was really where I had this kind of light bulb moment when I realized actually we need a thesis on this to try and bring those two worlds closer together, science and scientific skepticism and the health and fitness industry. And that essentially is what the book is. It's reframing the health and wellness industry through the critical lens of scientific skepticism. So while I was doing my PhD back in 2011, on the side, I'm writing notes and accumulating research for my book. And then I didn't actually sit down and start pulling everything together and start writing it until about 2018. Worked on that for about 18 months and then finally got it published through Routledge in 2020. So it was a long time in development, and I can honestly say that it's not the perfect book. I think if I were to rewrite it now, I would write it a little bit different. But in terms of the content, it's everything that I wanted it to be. And as I've said, that the main essence is that we are looking at the health and fitness industry and reframing it through a critical lens.
Yeah, so you're saying it's not regular. Again, we did a bit of a pre-chat. So you've mentioned to me the lack of regulation. Why don't you flesh that out a bit so you can make claims, and how much level of support do they have to have for their claims at the moment? Obviously, it's going to differ from country to country, but
yeah, every country works slightly differently. Obviously, we have the Federal Trade Commission in the US, and in Australia, ACCC do most of the work. And in the UK, again, it's a different governing body. The main take-home message is that the regulations are disturbingly lax. The regulations are almost non-existent, when we contrast that to the regulations that are in place before we can put a new drug on sale or a new drug that becomes available to patients, there has to be a minimum threshold of evidence that is surpassed before that drug can become available. They have to do preclinical trials. You know, we can look at the most recent COVID vaccines, for example. There are preclinical trials. Then there are clinical trials that take place in human patients with, you know, an ever increasing number of patients. We start with a very small group. By the time we come to the end of clinical trials, we're testing the thing on tens of thousands of people. Then it goes to a regulatory commission that look at the evidence and so forth. But there is a minimum threshold of evidence that has to be surpassed before a new drug can become available. Now, it's not a perfect system. We could do a whole separate podcast on the problems with that system. Yes. But in the health and wellness industry, there is absolutely no regulation at all. So manufacturers can make whatever products they want. They can make whatever claims they like. And there is absolutely no obligation to evidence. And very rarely do manufacturers actually get picked up on making false claims. And a lot of the time, whether it's a manufacturer of a fad diet or a supplement or a training garment or a running shoe or a new wristwatch gadget, they can pretty much make whatever claims they like, and they don't have any obligation to evidence or science or even the truth. And this is a big problem, because when we look at population critical faculties, which are in general hopelessly underdeveloped, it's, you know, we are walking, talking prey to the 21st century snake oil salesman. We were talking about snake oil salesmen, that they still exist. They're still around today, and they're selling whey protein and supplements and fad diets and training programs, and they all want your money. They all want to empty your wallet.
Incredible variety of things. It would take 3 weeks to write down all the things people are trying to flog nowadays.
Well, as an example, in the first chapter of the book, I do this kind of thought experiment, and I sat myself down in a room for a couple of hours, and I tried to come up with 3 of the most ridiculous products that I could possibly think of. And the first one was like a pair of
that would be very hard.
Yeah, so some underwear that
narrow it down.
that can help you burn calories. And I came up with some kind of. Are you allowed to swear on this podcast? I try not
probably,
to. Okay, yeah. I'll say BS. It's some kind of BS physiological mechanism for how this kind of underwear can help you burn calories and help you exercise. And I did that for 3 of the most, you know, ridiculous products that I could think of. Each one with specific claims based on a nonsense mechanism. And in all 3 cases, these things are already on sale. People are already making money with it. And,
sorry, hang on. Did you say you made them up? Or you saying...
I made them up. I sat in a room and I tried to come up with 3 of the most ridiculous products that I could think of, based on a you know, some kind of superficial mechanism. Maybe there was a nugget of truth to it. You know, maybe there's a little bit of science that's been extrapolated beyond all reason.
Oh my gosh.
And in all 3 cases, there's a product like this already on sale.
I missed that. I thought you said there was a product. I thought you were trying to like come up with the most ridiculous product from what was out there. You actually made
no, I made it up. I tried to come up with 3 products that could feasibly go on sale based on a BS mechanism.
Okay.
And one of them was some underwear that help you burn calories, and another one was like a special kind of injection that, that you know.
I think you're onto something here. So I think you've got the BS meter happening there. So you need to come up with these things, and then if they're not out there already, you need to make them and sell them.
Well, the idea was to problematize and consciousness raise for the readers, to get people to understand the extent of the problem. Because often I'm asked, you know, what products, you know, what products don't work? You know, I'm curious to know I'm like, what products do work? You know, 99% of them are based on BS mechanisms and false claims and bad science. The vast majority of products don't work. To find the products that do work, you have to really sift through this, you know, tens of thousands of different products.
Trouble is, everyone's too busy nowadays, right? Well, okay, that's not true, because I'm sure you talk about how busy we are now, and then you look back and people used to work, you know, 13 hours a day, or, you know, have 13 kids. 13 is a number at the moment for some reason. But, you know, my grandfather was the youngest of 13. I think they must have been kind of busy, you know. So anyway, but the point is, we have so much information being thrown at us nowadays. You know, I read somewhere that in Australia anyway, if you go to buy some olive oil, there's 64 different choices, you know, so everything's so complicated. How are you going to you know, analyze every single different thing and work out this? So I guess, and then also people sometimes are looking for the easy way out. So, you know, they want to lose weight, they want to get fit. Oh, let's have this pill, you know. So I don't know if that plays a role or what's going on.
Well, no, that's absolutely crucial. And you've hit on kind of one of the main tenets of critical thinking is understanding the way that we make decisions. And I write about this in the book, and I've written about it since, because being a skeptic, being a critical thinker in the exercise science domain, it's really important to understand the way that we make decisions as humans. And human logic and human reason have evolved to help us navigate hypersocial groups. And we've developed this series of what we call heuristics, which are kind of mental shortcuts. They're approximations of reality to help us to arrive at very quick and efficient conclusions. And this served a very important survival advantage. You know, 10,000 years ago when we were hunter-gatherers and we had to predict weather patterns or movements of migrating animals, but human lives nowadays and human genes are incongruous. You know, with the advent of the internet and social media, we really don't have the critical faculties that are sharp enough to help us to navigate contemporary society. When you look at how dramatically it's changed over the last even 50 years, so we've got to upgrade our critical faculties to help us to make decisions based on contemporary culture. And the vast majority of people haven't taken that additional step because our genes haven't changed, not really in the last 10,000 years or so. But society has changed dramatically, you know, in so many different ways. And so the way that we make decisions really is getting us into a lot of trouble, because what it comes down to is people want shortcuts, and manufacturers know this. And I wrote about this recently in Skeptical Inquirer. If there was one critical lesson that my recent work in health and wellness, if you could boil that down into one takeaway message, it would be that manufacturers understand our biases better than we do. And so marketing campaigns are designed to exploit our decision-making processes, to exploit the flaws in our decisions, to exploit our biases. And so part of being a critical thinker is to understand the way that you make decisions and try to mitigate your biases as much as possible. So that's a really important part of it.
Wow. I was thinking, when you said about our genes haven't changed, I think about evolution. One stage I heard that not that long ago, maybe 200 years ago or something, you would only ever meet like 34 people in your life. That would be the average, because, you know, you just lived and you wouldn't be able to travel far and whatever. So, you know, there's all sorts of stuff that goes with that. But the fact is, you only had to work out if 33 people or 34 people were trying to scam you or whatever. Now, you know, on the internet, we haven't developed to, you know, how are we meant to know, you know, that all these new ways of scamming you, you know, whatever it is, that you know, you get sent a text and you go, oh, I'll click on that. And it's like, oh, you just downloaded some, you know, virus, or it's just so complicated now.
We get exposed to tens of thousands of different adverts and sales pitches every day. You know, the average US adult gets exposed to tens of thousands of different adverts, and we're bombarded with so much data that we don't know what to do with it. And so being able to distinguish between information and misinformation is absolutely crucial. And again, the vast majority of people who are using, for example, social media, haven't done classes in critical thinking, or they haven't read books, they haven't upskilled, they haven't sharpened their critical thinking tools to be able to distinguish between information, misinformation, and disinformation, which is this is a big part of how we're in a society here where 25% of the population don't trust vaccines, and a large percentage of the population don't believe in climate change, despite the fact that the scientific consensus is absolutely unequivocal. And so it's not just, as you said earlier, it's not just about exercise science. This is obviously what we're interested in. It extends to all facets of society. What it comes down to is equipping yourselves with the information and the skills that you need to be able to make responsible decisions as an adult in society, and to actually contribute to society in a meaningful way.
Right. I wonder if we can just, we've been throwing these terms around a bit. So skeptical, skepticism, cynical, sorry, not cynical, critical, whatever. I wonder if we just sort of define those a bit. So being skeptical versus critical thinker versus even cynical, because you can get the point where you become cynical. They all obviously kind of overlap. Maybe just, I don't know, just flesh those out a little bit.
I'd be happy to. So I consider myself to be a skeptic, and a lot of people will use that term to say, oh, you're so skeptical the whole time. And I always correct them, no, you mean cynical. Sometimes I'm cynical as well, but to be a cynic has all these negative connotations. Actually, the original Greek meaning of the word to be skeptical was skeptikos, which translates to inquirer, to be an inquirer. So this is someone who isn't necessarily satisfied with the explanations that they're given and is always looking for additional layers of truth. And so, so this developed, in ancient Greece, along with the modern scientific method. We talk about Socrates or Socratic, who I've got here, and he's the godfather of the modern scientific method, because the Socratic method of evidence inquiry and testing hypotheses developed into the scientific method that we all know and love today. And the modern incarnation of scientific skepticism, I guess we owe that to people like Carl Sagan, who and James Randi, who sadly, both of those guys sadly no longer with us, and they are sort of the godfathers of the modern scientific skepticism. And they established the Center for Inquiry and Skeptical Inquirer, who I have the privilege of writing for now. And so the modern idea of scientific skepticism is there's nothing negative about it. It's just always looking for a little bit more evidence, always looking for more explanations, and not taking for granted what you're told. That's different to being a cynic, which I guess it has negative connotations. I'm not a cynic, but I am a skeptic. I always want more evidence and more data.
Cynic's almost doing it for its own sake and wanting to catch people out and whatever. But skepticism, they say healthy level of skepticism. It's extremely important. And
well, I always have an open mind. That's the thing. And people don't understand this about me. They think that I'm just rubbishing everything that I come across. And actually, when I hear about a new product, device, supplement, I'm always open-minded to the fact that maybe it could improve performance. Now, okay, you look for red flags and you look at the language that's used in the advertising rhetoric, and it starts bringing these red flags, and you very quickly get a bit of an idea as to whether this is likely to be, an effective use of your time. But ultimately, it comes down to the evidence. It comes down to the data and plausibility. So there's this notion that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So if somebody comes up with a supplement that can do all these magnificent things, and that on the surface of it would seem to contravene what we know about human physiology, well, I'm open to that, but you've got to show me some impressive data. And if you can't, then I'm sorry, you're going to have to go to the back of the line. And so it comes back to the Richard Feynman quote of have an open mind, but not so open that your brain falls out. Which I love, is a wonderful quote.
Which I think is a very important thing. You've got to be open. It's just part of, I think it's part of integrity, scientific integrity. Like sometimes you'll have people that sort of have this hobby horse. So even if we're not talking about these extraordinary claims, we're talking about researchers with PhDs, 30-year careers, whatever, but they'll stick to a particular line of thinking, and you just, there's all this evidence, and they just kind of, when they write their papers, they leave out, the stuff that doesn't suit them and whatever. That is not keeping an open mind, and that has not been a good research, really, is it?
Yeah, and this comes back to confirmation bias, because sadly, being a scientist and having a classical science education does not protect any individual against confirmation bias and having flawed beliefs. It can help you to evaluate evidence within your very narrow domain, but it doesn't necessarily make you a good critical thinker. And so actually, we need the independent vertical integration of critical thinking classes into science education, particularly exercise science, because we always teach research methods.
Yes.
And research methods is very useful and highly appropriate for producers of science. So people who are designing scientific studies and trying to mitigate bias and talking about statistical power and control groups and randomized controlled trials and so forth. But it isn't relevant for consumers of science. And those are two distinct things. And so this is when you have, at the extreme end of the spectrum, you have medical doctors who are homeopaths, for example. They're obviously, they have a science education, but they're not critical thinkers. Or you have, I received an email a little while ago from somebody who had a PhD in quantum physics, but they also believed in astrology, and they were trying to convince me that the movement of the moon had an effect on human mood and motivations. And in very rare cases, you have a climatologist who maybe doesn't follow the evidence for climate change, and that's particularly rare. But obviously it does happen, and so it goes without saying that being a scientist and being a critical thinker are two separate things. So we need vertical integration of critical thinking classes into science education. Research methods is not enough. It's not sufficient because it's a different skill set.
Something I thought of, when you're talking about snake oil salesman, so, it's a classic sort of person, but the idea back then was, as far as I understand, I'm sure you're more up on the history of it, but what I'd heard is that the original sort of snake oil salesperson, it was a salesman then, but you now have to say salesperson, which is fine. They would go into a town, they would have their snake oil or whatever, and then by the time people realized it was a scam or whatever, they'd take off to the next town. But now you've actually got the internet, and it's like the opposite. So instead of like trying to hide away and find this new group of people, these people are out there proudly, saying, buy my underwear or whatever you were talking about before, and it's all over the internet. So I guess it sort of is weird, because you almost think that's easier to debunk because you can just go boom. But I guess if you're getting to like billions of people, all you need is like 500,000 to like believe it and buy it, and you've made your margin. Is that, I don't know.
It's a really interesting point, actually, because there are different ideas about how snake oil first came about. The narrative that I understood it was that the Chinese immigrant workers were working on the transcontinental railway in the sort of mid-1800s, and it was very difficult work, backbreaking work, and they used to rub oil from the Chinese water snake into their sore muscles and joints, and they shared that with their Confederate and sort of veteran Confederate co-workers. And before long, there were groups who were touring this snake oil preparation around North America, and they would stage these very elaborate and theatrical shows where somebody, with a really conspicuous limp would walk up, and he would rub the snake oil onto his joints, and then he'd be dancing around, and it was obviously theatrics, obviously just dramatized, but they would fall for it. And then, as you say, before they realized that the thing actually didn't work, they'd moved on to the next town. Nowadays things are very, very different, because false belief or misinformed belief is very much ingrained. It's people become indoctrinated. And all you need is a critical mass of, 10,000 shares or 50,000 Facebook followers on a new product to lend it some kind of false legitimacy. You need a certain number of people to believe in that stuff before the appeal to popularity is enough to get the product to sell. You see that 100,000 units of this thing have been sold, and people that are sure that it's helped them to, perform better, it's given them more energy, it's cured their low back pain, whatever it happens to be. And that's enough on which to base a product these days, particularly in the current climate where we don't have any regulations on this stuff. So it's these products are being sold in a very different climate now. And the whole way that social media platforms work, and it's a big part of the problem, we keep coming back to social media, is that people curate their feeds depending on what they want to see. And so if you believe that chiropractic is an effective form of pain relief, then you're going to follow people who believe the same thing. The people who follow you are going to believe the same thing, and you create an echo chamber whereby you're never exposed to any kind of alternative viewpoint. And so this is how people become indoctrinated into any worldview.
Anything, yes. So yeah, that's again the polarizing thing with the Democrats, the Republicans, the whatever, because they're not seeing the other viewpoint.
And just to touch on that, you know, I think we won't go into that in too much detail, but all there is to say is that most Republicans watch Fox, right, and most Democrats
CNN.
watch CNN, right, and they're two extremes of the opposite ends of the spectrum, and
Yes.
And very few Democrats ever bother to watch Fox and vice versa.
You're in an echo chamber.
So yeah, exactly. You're just living in an echo chamber. So I think it's important always look to falsify your hypothesis. But unfortunately, it's much more comfortable to try and confirm your pre-existing hypothesis.
Without saying which way I lean or right or whatever, it's quite interesting because sometimes I would be watching the one I normally watch, but then if I go to a conference, especially being from Australia, we go to a conference and we don't, usually have CNN and Fox, whatever on, but you go into the gym and the other one might be on and you go, oh, okay, that's the only time I'd sort of see the other side, Now, interestingly, I saw an article which intrigued me and I wanted you to explain it to me that you had. It was from debunking to pre-bunking. So that's a nice title. It got me thinking, but explain what you mean there.
Yeah, so this is an article that I wrote for the current issue of Skeptical Inquirer magazine, the print magazine, and I was honoured that it became the feature article for the issue. And the notion that we are all engaged in debunking myth and misinformation, and this is a good thing. So if you see somebody, again, let's bring it back to exercise science, you see somebody selling a fad diet, or there's a new weight loss supplement, or there's a new trendy training program that, and really you're looking at thinking the claims here really don't match up to scrutiny, and that there's no scientific evidence for this. And I'm sure anybody listening to this or watching this can think of any one of these products off the top of their head. And it's a good thing to go on this kind of debunking tirade where you actually say, okay, you know what, I'm going to call out the misinformation here. And you say, well, this product actually, when you look at the evidence, it doesn't work. And this is something that people have gotten used to doing. And debunking works. So that's not, you've got to do more than just saying, this is rubbish. You're talking, you're talking nonsense and this thing doesn't work. You have to go a step further and actually provide some evidence for why it doesn't work and actually why the belief surrounding this particular product is misinformed. And you've got to do you've got to layer it. And it's helpful to be respectful. And the evidence shows that actually trying to debunk somebody's misinformed political beliefs actually isn't very effective, because political beliefs, like religious beliefs, are very much ingrained. And there are some instances where debunking misinformation isn't very effective. So as I've said, when the belief is very, is firmly rooted, if somebody has a very staunch belief. So debunking works, but there are some instances where it isn't so effective. So actually, as skeptics and critical thinkers, if we really want to try and change the world and get people thinking more critically, we're not teaching people what to think, but how to think. That's the essence of critical thinking. We have to use more sophisticated methods. So that's where pre-bunking comes in. So essentially, that there are several forms of pre-bunking. One of them is this idea of inoculation theory. So just like when you introduce a vaccine to somebody, you are training their immune system to recognize the threat down the line. So you might introduce a deactivated virus that does no harm to the body, but you're training the body's immune system that the body has an immune response, so that when they come into contact, if they come into contact with the actual virus, then the body's immune system is prepared and ready to tackle the virus before it does, any considerable harm to the human. And vaccines, I think it's fair to say, is responsible for, saving millions and millions of lives over the years. I think back to the most obvious example pre-COVID was the polio vaccine. Jonas Salk developed this vaccine and refused to patent it because he said you couldn't patent the sun, right? This vaccine is here for everybody, and he's credited with saving millions and millions of lives. With this polio vaccine, it was a crippling disease before that. And so you can do the same thing with misinformation. You can expose somebody to a very weak form of misinformation. You can explain to them how it's misinformation, how actually it's bypassing their critical thinking filters and exploiting their biases. And in that way, you can actually train somebody's critical faculties to recognize a more considerable threat to their critical faculties later on down the line. So it's this idea of vaccinating against misinformation. And then you can take that one step further, which is going back to what we were talking about earlier, which is actually getting people to undergo more robust critical thinking classes. And that means teaching people about bias, teaching people about confirmation bias, for example, which is how people look more favorably on evidence that conforms or that confirms their pre-existing beliefs, and they tend to be able to overlook evidence that contradicts their pre-existing belief. Teaching people about bias, teaching people science literacy, media literacy, social media literacy, so understanding how social media algorithms are generating content based on their previous viewing history. And all of this comes under the umbrella of critical thinking. So rather than just debunking misinformation and telling people that they're wrong and giving people evidence, that can only go so far. Actually, what we need is to pre-bunk and actually teach people ahead of time to be good critical thinkers, so that when somebody tries to sway their thinking with flawed arguments and misinformed beliefs, then they're in a much better position to distinguish information from misinformation.
Yeah, it's actually so many levels of this, because you know, you're talking about doing classes and teaching critical thinking or whatever. One thing I did was I had this thing where I'd get journal articles, because, you know, people tend to think if it's published. That's what I keep seeing on the media with talking about misinformation. What you say, if this was in a journal article, but as you know, there's different levels of journal article. You could have a kind of crappy finding, but you'll still get it published, especially nowadays when you can actually like pay to get your journal published. So people don't necessarily think, they think this is published. They don't think, oh, this is in Nature versus this is in this crappy journal. You paid like $3,000 to get it published. They just think that's peer review and published, you know. So anyway, it just reminded me, I did a thing in a class once where I got a journal article. I was trying to get them to be critical, and so I made copies of it, and I took out, well, electronically, I covered up the title. I took out the abstract, and then they had to write the title of the abstract and then answer these questions about, did their data fit with their results? You know, did the stats they do, was it appropriate or whatever? And, you know, it was a good exercise, I think, but it was a challenge, you know, and that's the sort of thing they had to really, you know, you can't just go, oh, it's published, therefore it's okay. You got to like actually look at it. And I think that's
super important. Anytime you can challenge people's conceptualizations of a paradigm or an industry in a new and interesting way, getting people to think outside the box, I think that's really crucial. So I love the example you gave there, and one thing that I do with my when I was teaching, I'm now a full-time researcher, but when I was teaching the introduction to critical thinking, well, I did the new laptop challenge, and I get everyone to think about the last time they bought something that was, you know, worth a bit of money. Or it doesn't have to be, you know, a new laptop. It could be the last time they got a phone, or the last time that they had to make a decision that maybe it's nothing to do with money, but that had some kind of, you know, major consequence. You know, you're going to start a new university course, or you're going to take a big decision. Did you just go to the store and ask the salesperson to recommend something to you? Maybe you did, but most people wouldn't just intuitively, that they would know not to just take that person's advice verbatim. They would probably, if it is the case of a new phone or a new laptop or, you know, a car or whatever, you're just going to go to the salesperson and ask for their advice. You might do that at first, but then you're going to go online and do some research, and you're going to speak to your friends, and you're going to look at online reviews, and you're going to look to see the performance of the thing, and you might look at the performance history, and you're going to collect data from as many different sources as possible, and then you're going to weigh up all the evidence that you have, and you're going to make an educated decision. So most people know when the stakes are high enough that they need to collect data from all of these different resources and come to an informed, educated decision. But for some reason, when it comes to a lot of health and wellness products and devices and paradigms, we tend to forget that. Whereas actually, it's intuitive that you wouldn't just take the salesperson's advice as gospel. You would actually do a lot more robust research than that.
That's a good point. It's interesting though, because it gets down also to sort of who you trust and who you respect, and that's what drives me crazy a little bit. So we know that if you go to buy a used car, you know, everyone says you can't trust used car salesmen. I'm sure that's not fair on some used car sales. We know that, right? But what gets up my goat, whatever you call it, is I go into a, whatever you call it, we call it chemist, pharmacy. And, you know, they trust there's a pharmacist there behind, you know, the desk or whatever. But 70% of the stuff in the pharmacies here anyway is supplements and, you know, all these things, which they could probably do without. And they, you know what I mean? But they've got that, they respect the pharmacist. It's kind of like how it used to be with doctors. Okay, doctors, obviously, I'm not putting down doctors, but everyone used to just say, if the doctor says it, that's it. But now people get on the internet. It must be terrible to be a medical doctor, actually, because everyone's going to come in, they're going to have their own theory about why they're sick. You know? What do you make of that? There's so much trust and respect or whatever that plays a role. You know?
There's a very fine balance here. I recently finished reading The Death of Expertise by Tom Nichols, and I highly recommend it. And it's a thesis on how we've lost respect for experts and how we're putting our faith in the wrong kinds of experts, because this contemporary culture that we live in, again, with social media and so forth, it elevates everyone to, you know, on this platform of equivalence. And so your opinion is just as good as mine, and even worse than that is that my opinion is just as good as your facts. And actually that's not the case at all. Facts are facts, opinions are subjective. And I think this is really important. We're not going to get to the bottom of it in this discussion, but needless to say that we have to respect experts when they're legitimate experts, and particularly when there's a scientific consensus. So the idea is that we don't take vaccines because a doctor, you know, tells you to take a vaccine. We take vaccines because 99.999% of doctors and scientists and medical professionals and people who know agree that vaccines are, if they've been authorized, are safe and effective. And it's the same again, to use climate science as an example. We know that climate change is a real thing. We know that it's anthropogenic, it's man-made. We know that it's a serious problem, not because you heard somebody on the news talking about it, not because your mate that you follow on social media has been sending you YouTube videos, but because the scientific consensus is that 99, you know, again, the vast majority of scientists, particularly climate scientists, agree that on the facts. And there are very few things that scientists disagree on in that respect. And it's the same in exercise science, that the vast majority of nutritionists and you know, and exercise physiologists tend to agree on most on most new interventions. And when there's a scientific consensus, well, and if you're an expert yourself, or you believe yourself to be an expert, yes, you're entitled to disagree. But if you're not an expert, then you have to look at your own credentials to be disagreeing with this.
Exactly.
And this is the problem, again, with social media. It elevates everyone's opinion to the level of expert, and it gives everyone a sounding board. And actually what we have to be doing is to be honest with ourselves, and we need to think, okay, I have an opinion on this, but actually is my opinion valid? So, for example, I'm an exercise physiologist. I've been doing this all my life. I have a PhD, I'm accredited. And I think in most matters of exercise physiology, my opinion matters. But if I haven't done the research in a particular area, I'll keep my mouth shut. And we you know, when we've spoken before, if you're not an expert in low carbohydrate diets or creatine, you know, supplementation or HIIT training or you know, exercise and effect, then you're probably just going to keep your opinion to yourself, because there are people who are legitimate experts. But if I'm going to get on a plane, I'm not going to knock on the door of the pilot and start telling the pilot, you know, how the different landing maneuvers, you know. And if I you know, need a surgery on my shoulder because I've got an injury, I'm not going to tell the surgeon where to start making the incision. And most people wouldn't, right? Because they know that when the stakes are high enough, they're more than happy to put their faith in experts. You know, when was the last time that somebody went in for a surgery and started lecturing the surgeon on how to perform this thing? They don't, because when the SHIT hits the fan, everybody, you know, develops this acute respect for experts. But when it comes to, you know, things like public health and vaccines and exercise and nutrition, everyone's an expert. Everyone's an expert until things get real, and then all of a sudden they take a step back.
People think, well, I eat food, so I'm an expert on nutrition, right?
Right. Yeah.
So one thing you'd said to me in the pre-chat was the level of claim. So you said how part of the reason you can't sort of sue these people and they get away with it is that they're quite, you know, they're not saying outright. Can you give us an example of how they sort of vaguely imply something, so you can't sort of hold them down in court, sort of thing?
Yeah, I'll give you two examples. So in the early 2000s, there was a brand called Power Balance. They developed these range of bracelets that had holograms in them, and the marketing rhetoric was that it's embedded with holograms that resonate with your body's natural frequencies to improve strength and vitality and balance and libido and all of these things. And this is a logical fallacy called blinding with science. You just throw lots of science-sounding terms at the consumer, and if you're not very scientifically literate, you're going to hear that and you're going to go, oh, that sounds legit. That sounds like it's, you know, it lends the product a false scientific legitimacy. And this thing sold, these things sold like hotcakes, mainly because the money was really, they put so much money into marketing and advertising, and they sponsored lots of athletes, and you could see some of the world's best athletes were walking around wearing these bracelets, and that in itself is another logical fallacy called the exposure effect. If you see this thing being used and being worn by famous athletes and celebrities, revered athletes, then people think, oh, well, if it's good enough for them, then it must work, right? And of course, it didn't work. There were a string of scientific studies showing that these things did absolutely nothing, and it had zero plausibility, of course, because holograms don't resonate with your body's natural frequencies, because your body doesn't have natural frequencies, and it's all just a load of nonsense. And eventually, the ACCC, the Australian Commission that we talked about earlier, there was a long case and a long investigation, and they deemed that Power Balance had engaged in misleading advertising, and they forced Power Balance to return all of their profits, and the company eventually went bankrupt. So that's one example of claims that are actually being chased down and shown to be false. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen often enough. So I could give you another example. Again, I wrote about this recently in Skeptical Inquirer, is the intravenous nutrient drip. So this is a drip that goes in intravenously, goes into an antecubital vein in the forearm. And there are various companies that sell these drips, and they call them fitness drips and rehydration drips and immune drips and weight loss drips and all of these kinds of things. But they're very clever with their claims, because they don't overtly claim that using this drip will make you thin. And they don't claim that using this drip will make you fit. What they do is they call it a fit drip, and they sell it online alongside these glossy images of young, healthy people with six-pack abs, and they're all very lean and attractive. And they will say that it contains amino acids and it contains vitamin C and all of these things that people assume are very healthy. And so they very carefully imply the claim without overtly stating it. So they're not actually saying something that can be legally challenged, but they're just very carefully misleading the consumer, kind of, you know, tugging at their shirt, leading them by the hand, and then it's the consumer that makes the inference. And so it's kind of a new wave of marketing rhetoric, whereby the manufacturer is very carefully, very subtly implying the claim and allowing the consumer to infer it, but they're not actually making any claims that are testable. And when you actually break down the ingredients of these drips, there's a core group of ingredients. They all contain, you know, bicarbonate and saline and vitamin C. And the fit drip contains amino acids, right? That's the only, actionable ingredient. So amino acids apparently make you fit. And the immune drip just contains more vitamin C, you know, so like vitamin C boosts your immune system. For people listening, I put that in quotes. And really, there's only one or two, again, quote unquote, active ingredients in each drip, and none of them really do anything. But because they're not overtly stating it, they can get away with it.
They might be, if they were taken to court, they might be able to say it's a fit drip because it actually fits. The drip actually fits, like
exactly.
The join fits. That's what they meant.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Yeah, it fits perfectly together, with the catheter and the drip. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
So how about we just talk about, I saw on Twitter, I think you had, I don't know, I don't think you'd be able to remember them all off the top of your head, but sort of 10, you had like 10 or 8 or something, things that you have to think about. So you had the false dichotomy, the false dichotomy, etc. Why don't you just explain, for example, what that is, or a couple of other sort of things that the sort of the technical things you look out for with being skeptical, I guess.
Yeah, so this is part of being a good skeptic, a good critical thinker, is to understand, as I said earlier, the ways that we make decisions and the ways that our decisions can be manipulated. And one of those ways is the logical fallacies. So this is a flaw in logic that can kind of lead somebody to incorrect conclusions. So I'll give you some examples to explain this. And this was from an article called 10 Health and Wellness Fallacies that every skeptic should know. So the obvious one is called an appeal to popularity. So this is when a protein supplement or any kind of supplement or a diet might be sold alongside the tagline, over 1 million units sold, or 1 million people following this diet. And of course, the fallacy is that this thing is somehow good or effective, or that you should follow it because lots of other people do. Yeah. And everybody will intuitively know that just because, if everybody jumped off a bridge, would you do it? Well, of course not. Something has to be evidence-based, and I want some proof that it works. I'm not just going to do it because lots of other people do it. So that's one really easy example of a logical fallacy. Just because, 1 million other people have bought this product, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's effective. So that's called the appeal to popularity. Let's talk about something a little bit more subtle called the appeal to nature. So this is the idea that something is better or more valid because it's quote unquote natural, and that natural things are better than unnatural or synthetic things. And this is all throughout the health and wellness industry. Anything that's sold with, again, quote unquote, all natural ingredients, anything that's free from chemicals, which is nothing because everything contains chemicals. If it were free from chemicals, it wouldn't exist, But this idea that chemicals are bad and chemicals are evil and we've got to avoid them cuts to the core of this fallacy. And I remember once asking a group of students, if you were going to take a supplement, how many of you would prefer to take a natural supplement? And everyone put their hands up. And I said, can you explain why? And they said, well, I prefer to put natural things in my body, which sounds so reasonable, doesn't it? Well, of course. I say, well, why? Well, I don't know. And if you keep asking why, you get to the core of why it's a fallacy. Because if you took a molecule of glucose that was synthesized in a lab and a molecule of glucose that was derived naturally, in nature from a plant, you look at it under an electron microscope, they have the same chemical structure. If you were to consume them, they'd have an identical effect on the body. Just because one of them is synthetic and one of them is natural, actually, there's no difference in it when you get to the core of it. And it really exposes this as a fallacy. We all have this ingrained bias for natural things, but it's not based on logic. Yes. So again, that's another example. Do you want one more? I
had the false dichotomy. What was that?
The false dichotomy is a good one because this is when you present, it's like an either or argument. You present that your training program, your running shoes, your diet is the only effective way to achieve weight loss or the only effective way to improve performance. And people are always arguing about what's more effective at helping with weight loss. Is it weight training or cardio? And people get in these fierce debates about whether we should be weight training or whether we should be doing cardio. And when you look at the literature, if you get somebody who's overweight to do something, they're going to lose weight. Now that could be walking, it could be swimming, it could be yoga, it could be weight training, it could be sitting on a bike. It doesn't really matter. If you get them to do something, increase their activity levels and correct their diet, then they more often than not lose weight. So presenting something as a false dichotomy that you've got to follow this program, you've got to take this supplement, or you're going to fail. That's a false dichotomy, when actually there's often many ways to achieve an outcome, you achieve your target. So the false dichotomy is another fallacy.
Yeah. So there's a lot of things with, choosing sides. You're either keto or you're not keto. You're either this or you're not this. And then there's also the thing about trying to stick to your claims. So when you've actually, this is where sometimes I'm a bit new to Twitter. I vaguely do Twitter, but since I've started the podcast, I do it more. I keep finding these people that have huge followings and things, or really well-respected researchers and things, and you start to get a bit skeptical sometimes. Are they pushing their hobby horse? Do they have a vested interest? Are they, flogging something? I don't even know. It's not even a question. It's just an observation.
Yeah, and this is a big problem with the way that that expert status is dished out nowadays. I always talk about how Twitter followers are not credentials. And I don't just mean Twitter, I mean any kind of followers, because you have revered athletes who have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of followers. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're an authority. Or you could have fitness influencers. Again, wrote about this recently. Fitness influencers are making a lot of money off the fact that you are following their account. Once you have more than about 10,000 followers on any kind of social media outlet, which isn't very many, that's monetizable. Yeah, you can start making money off the back of that through sponsored advertising, through sponsored posts. And something like a third of Instagram users you're legally obliged to state, you have to put a notice when you're posting something that is sponsored, when it's a sponsored post. And apparently over a third of Instagram users don't do that, so that they're legally obliged to do so, but they could be advertising something without actually stating that it's a sponsored post. And this is a real problem, because when you get guys like Michael Phelps, who is, the most successful Olympian in history, not just the most successful swimmer, the most successful Olympian, and he's posting pictures on his Instagram account of him taking a supplement or doing cupping, which is a widely discredited ancient Chinese therapy. And that's going out to millions and millions of impressionable people. And he's not an authority on cupping. He's not an authority on recovery strategies. He's a very successful swimmer, very successful athlete, but actually he's not an authority on this subject. But people assume that he is because he's got X number of followers. And you've always got to pose the question, again, being a good skeptic is asking for more evidence. Why is this person posting about cupping? Why is this person posting about a new supplement? And is it valid because they are posting about it? Actually, I prefer to invest in some kind of intervention because it has merit, because it actually works, because there's scientific evidence to show that it works, not just because this person is posting about it. And more often than not, if they are posting about a new training program or a new supplement, it's because they've got some kind of ulterior motive. They're getting paid for it, or they have investments in the company that are making the product. And if you just dig a little deeper, I looked at I was looking at Ben Greenfield, who's an Instagram, he's a fitness influencer. He's constantly posting all sorts of things. He's got hundreds and hundreds of thousands of followers. And if you go to his website and do a bit of digging around, you see that he's got financial investments in, dozens of different companies and different supplement manufacturers. And you can get an insight as to, okay, well, why is he posting about these supplements all the time? What vested interest has he got? So you've always got to be asking that question, why are they posting about this?
Yes. Now, one thing, this is probably a bit contentious, but one thing I've thought about, we've talked about misinformation and vaccines and things, and left and right politics and whatever. One thing that's occurred in the last, few years is censorship. So, with Facebook, so if you say, for example, the president of the United States, getting kicked off Twitter, things he said, obviously. If you say something against, the vaccines, the COVID narrative, you can actually have your Twitter account suspended and all that. this is not necessarily your area, but what do you think about that? Because you know, you go back to Copernicus saying that he thought the Earth was round, and it didn't go down too well, and he was right, but he got censored. Now, what do you think about that? It's a bit of a tricky one, and I've probably caught you off guard a bit, but what do you make of that? I'm not a particularly, you can probably tell from the question, I'm not a particularly big fan of censorship, and I've said here and there that, you know, I like the good old days when you would only get censored, or you'd only like not get a visa to come to Australia if you're a climate change, Holocaust denier. That was about the only time you'd hear that. And there'd be a debate, like, should this person have free speech or not? But now you've got, you know, even Ron Paul, you know, people have got kicked off. What do you think of that? Do we need to be, you know, skeptical, this misinformation, but to the point where you're not allowed to even say it? You know what I mean?
Yeah, but I think there are very few instances where it's acceptable to actually censor someone, and in that case, it's probably not censorship. So, you know, you're not allowed to incite. Hate speech you won't tolerate. You're not allowed to incite violence against another person. So that's not censorship. That's a legal. Yes. That's a legal issue, and you're not. And libel is the other thing. So these are two kind of libel, like if it's slander and libel, that kind of thing. So these are two areas where it's not censorship, but it's kind of there are legal issues associated with that. Other than that, I think being in a society that is based on free speech, that's the cornerstone of civilization. Is people being able to say what they feel, and I don't think people should be censored for that in almost any respect. You know, we've got people who are allowed to demonstrate. If you believe the most outrageous, ridiculous conspiracy theory, then you want to gather in the street and have a convention, then you should be allowed to do that. That's your right to free speech. The point where it starts to become a little bit contentious is when that free speech starts to impinge on things like public health policy. So when we talk about vaccine misinformation, for example, which is such a huge problem, and we talk about the dirty dozen or the misinformation dozen, or the disinformation dozen, this idea that something like 65% of the COVID misinformation came from 12 people on social media, pretty much, and they're spreading the vast majority of misinformation. And you know, I'm not sitting on one side of the fence or the other, but I think it does create a little bit more of a problem when misinformation starts to affect public health on a broad scale. So if 30% of the population don't want to get a vaccine because of misinformation, well, then, and you know, for example, the ex-president of the United States is you know, tweeting misinformation, again, maybe about vaccines, then is it acceptable to remove that person from platform where they can reach millions and millions of people? I'm not saying yes or no, but I think it is a slightly more gray area, because we're talking about people's lives here. You know, lives are going to be lost through misinformation. But this is nothing new. You know, when you look at people tweeting about chiropractic, or it could be cupping, or acupuncture, you know, or any kind of homeopathic remedy. You know, homeopathy is a great example because there's no active ingredient, and there are very tragic cases in the scientific literature and in the media of people trying to use homeopathic or other naturopathic remedies to treat very serious conditions, and people die.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, people die, people losing their lives.
Yeah.
So would it be censorship to ban somebody if somebody's selling a supplement that they claim can cure cancer or cure AIDS or some kind of bacterial meningitis, and they're saying, you know, follow my breathwork program and it can cure your asthma, and then people are dying of asthma attacks because they've stopped taking their medication? Would it be censorship to ban that person from social media, or are you saving lives? I don't know the answer. It's a very tricky one.
It's a very tricky one.
It's a very, very difficult conversation to have.
Yeah, because you can imagine if someone's, I'm stuck in your underwear example. I can't remember what it was, but it just did my head in. So you could say, let's censor that, and you could probably make an argument for that. So you could almost go, one way or the other, even though we both believe in free speech or whatever. You could almost go like at the same time. You could say, I think we should censor that. So yeah, it's interesting.
Well, one observation that I found is people love what I do generally. They love that I bring a critical lens to the health and fitness world. And when I debunk cupping, they love it. And when I talk about chiropractic and there's no evidence for that, they love it. And they're really interested when I do literature reviews on things. And I sometimes, I look at a particular product and I say, well, it might work for this, but it doesn't work for all these other things. And they like that I bring a level of nuance to it. They love what I do until I tell them that
against their belief. Exactly.
Yeah. Once I land on their thing, it's like Ricky Gervais talked about this, famous British comedian.
Yeah.
And he goes after everything. There's nothing off limits with him. And he said the same thing about comedy, is that people find everything that I say funny until I criticize their belief, or until I talk about their issue. And so when that happens, you've got to start asking yourself, well, maybe I need to think about the root of my beliefs, and actually, if I'm happy for everyone else's beliefs to be debunked and to be put under the skeptical microscope, then there's no belief system that is above scrutiny. That you can't have every belief system, even science, even skepticism has to. Experts have to prove their contentions like everyone else. There's no past here.
I love Ricky Gervais. I love Ricky Gervais. And one of my greatest moments actually is when as I said, I didn't really do Twitter, but I've started doing it. And I saw his show Afterlife, and I wrote something about it, and I got a like. I only had like 2 likes because I hadn't had any followers, and it was Ricky Gervais. Ricky Gervais my tweet.
Awesome.
It's like,
great.
Maybe Twitter's kind of fun after all. All right. So thanks a lot for coming on. Is there anything we haven't covered you wanted to sort of get out, or feels like we've covered a few things?
Well, we've covered a lot. I think something that you said earlier on about there's so many layers to this, and there are so many layers to science and being a good skeptic and critical thinker. And I suppose if there's a take-home message that I want the listeners to acknowledge, it's that anybody can be a good critical thinker, and you can always sharpen your critical faculties. Whether you're a scientist, you could be a really well-established scientist who's been doing this for decades.
Absolutely.
But you've always got to be questioning the root of your own beliefs, and there's always more to learn. So read books about critical thinking, watch lectures on critical thinking, learn about, if you haven't watched lectures from James Randi and Richard Feynman and Hitchens and all of these guys, look them up on YouTube.
Yes.
Read books, listen to lectures, listen to podcasts, and just sharpen your critical faculties, because those faculties can never be too sharp, and you can always improve as a skeptic and as a critical thinker. It won't just make you a better exercise scientist, it won't just make you a better athlete, but it will make you a more robust and responsible citizen, able to make more informed and more educated decisions in this society that is saturated by bad science and social media and commerce. And so we've got to do everything that we can.
And it's likely to be scammed even, when you get this, click on this link, All right, well, thanks a lot. One thing I was going to say that I really liked, that I took away from this, is the pre-bunking thing. I reckon that's really cool. That's something I've never been close to hearing about or thinking about. So that's interesting. So yeah, thanks again for coming on.
Oh, it's my pleasure. That was a lot of fun. Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Good on you. Okay, see you, mate. Bye.
Cheers.